that he was in called Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. Any of you ever read that? Anyone? It was standard reading in American high schools for a while. Or I think it was. Whatever. But anyway, Death of a Salesman is about this guy that is played by Dustin Hoffman, who is getting up there in age, and he's a salesperson. He's a salesman. That's why it's called Death of a Salesman. And in this scene, we see him going to his boss, asking for a raise. And the boss says, sorry, Willie, you're not selling as much as you used to, and things are tight. I can't give you a raise. And Willie says, I can't do this. I can't pay my insurance. I can hardly feed my family. I need a raise. Things get a little heated. The boss fires Willie. And Willie says, I came in here when this was a small operation. I worked for your father. I've been here for 30 years. I gave my life for this company. I built this company. And now, okay, I'm not selling as much as I used to, but I'm not asking for so much of a return anymore. I'm just asking for a livable wage. And now you're firing me? And his famous line here is, you can't eat the orange and just throw away the peel. Okay? So what is this getting at? Oh, he also talks about how in the past things were different in the business. Like he would get on the train. This takes place in the 1930s, right? So you have to imagine he started at the turn of the previous century. It says you used to get on a train and everybody would know each other, and all the salespeople would talk to each other. Now it's not like that anymore. Things are much bigger. Everybody's going their own way. Everybody has to follow the structure that they have to follow. So what's he talking about? About the impersonalization that comes with bureaucracy, right? And I think it's like that's what you are dealing with as well. Like you go to a bureaucracy in Italy and they look at you as a number and not as a person, right?
Yeah, but more than that is that I think when you get too much departmentalized, you don't have anyone who has a general viewpoint. So maybe your problem is in between two different departments, and none of those two can help you. And so you're stuck, and everything takes so much time because they have to communicate with each other because they're not in the same bureau. So I think that's the main problem that you could get into if you're too much
of a bureaucracy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Jacob?
I think also in this case in Germany, we have also a bit not that effective bureaucracy. It's more that like bureaucracy is not in sense of like Max Weber, that he is like, in sense of Napoleon, that he wants to make it more effective, but just like keeping the whole system more ineffective because there are too many rules and stuff, not the unpersonalization. So
yeah, that's exactly what we see Dustin Hoffman acting out, that the human being isn't there. Everybody is so focused on the rules and the procedures that a simple problem that may fall through the cracks, no one can solve, right? Because there are these rules and procedures. It's not my department, it's another department, and the other department gives you a runaround. And that's horrible both for the customers and the clients, as well as for the individuals working there. And that's one of the problems that comes up with bureaucracy, that the people that have to get something from the bureaucracy, like the customers and the members of society and the employees, they're not parts of a machine. They're individuals, and they have individual interests that are ignored. And there's no such thing as informal relationships. In a bureaucracy, remember, no, you cannot bring personal relationships to bear. That doesn't exist. So you have a unique problem, no one cares. And unfortunately, when we write procedures, we can't solve every single problem that might emerge. We can't predict them in advance. But the bureaucracy operates on the assumption that the procedures cover everything, when they don't. That's when things falls between these different units, right? The procedures and the structures didn't anticipate this, and bad luck for you, right? And finally, how innovative can you be? Can you come up with new ideas in a bureaucracy? Absolutely not, right? everything assumes stability, and the procedures and structures are built to maintain that stability. So Jacob, when you talk about wanting to do something a little bit different and the system just doesn't allow it because it's there to ensure its own stability, how would you build a high-tech company based on this Weberian model? Right? Probably doesn't work. Okay, so we did the first one. We're going to go through these a little bit faster, but I think you guys need a break. So let's come back at 10 minutes past the hour. Sound good?
Yes. And also just a fun fact for bureaucracy in Italy, we're still paying the tax on the horses that were used to like carry the carriages in the 80s, like in the 19th century. So that's how old our bureaucracy system is.
Maintain the stability. Good point. Good example, right? All right, thanks. I'll see you in 15 minutes. Good point. Good example, right? All right, 15 minutes. Good point. Good example, right? All right. Okay, let's start. Everybody back? Except for me, my video's not on, sorry. Okay, so at around the same time that Weber is writing, Frederick Taylor is writing. Most of his writing occurs at around, his most prolific writing occurs around the time of World War I, and he dies soon after that. But his approach, his concern is similar to Weber's. He's writing later. There are other things going on in his environment that are leading him to think about the issues, about how to create order from chaos and how to make companies more effective. There's a need to do this with World War I in the picture. And his idea is to use science, to leverage science, harness science to make, to enhance productivity. And his focus is not on the organization and building systems and structures within the organization. His focus is on how to actually organize the work tasks. And hence, we have the field of industrial engineering. Okay. His idea is that we can be most productive if we take people and turn them into a commodity, so that we don't have to rely on a lot of training and development of people over the years to get work done. Rather, we structure the work so that anybody could do the work, and that you can simply slot someone in and have the work done. And the idea behind this is that, yes, there's going to be a need for thinkers, but only a limited number of thinkers to design the work, to do the engineering. And then after that, it's just a matter of putting people at work to be productive without them having to think about what they do. So what's going on at the time that he's writing is, just like I said before, he's writing at the time where there's tremendous unrest, particularly in Russia, right? But not only in Russia, there's trade union organizing throughout Europe, throughout the United States. Some of this is actually quite violent. We see the emergence of socialist and communist parties that are terrifying to capitalists. We see massive organizations developing, first with railroads that need more productive ways of getting the work done, safer ways of coordinating. and they're using the Weberian ideas of bureaucracy and departments, but still, how do we make organizations more effective? And Taylor is obsessed by science. He's looking to see how we can use quantitative methods to be more productive. But he's also very concerned with the conflict that's emerging around work. Again, unions, anarchists, strikes, strike breakers, a lot of violence. And his perception here is that this doesn't need to be this way. Why don't we organize work in such a way that there are enough resources for everyone, right? His argument essentially is that if I can make organizations very productive, then I can pay people a lot of money. And okay, they have to check their brains in at the factory door and work like robots during the day. But at the end of the day, and it could be a short day because they're so productive, they can have full lives. And with all the money that they have, they can spend it on things and live in a way that they couldn't spend, they couldn't live before. And all this because we're making the work itself so much more productive. Elijah.
Did Taylor ever take into account, especially because it was during the Industrial Revolution, that this idea of being an automated worker, that at one point machines would automate enough and then this wouldn't work anymore because it would make humans obsolete? Or did he just not take that into account?
He didn't take that into account. That comes later. There are a lot of things he didn't take into account. Other people were always concerned with automation and how they would lose their jobs. But as a thinker about this, he thought this was actually, he didn't put much thought into it. His perception was from what we call in sociology the functionalist school. If it makes things more productive and people and society can generate greater resources, it's only a good thing, right? And essentially those that are displaced by the automation will find other places where their labor is necessary because economies will grow with all of these resources we're able to generate by being so much more productive, okay? So the focus is on efficiency. Taylor is the great efficiency expert, right? How do we make systems more efficient? And the focus is on the tasks themselves, breaking down the tasks into the smallest elements, so that every individual can perform certain tasks that lead into other tasks, and everything is predictable, and no one has to think. And the way that we enhance efficiency is we literally walk around with a stopwatch, and we test the degree to which we can produce things with fewer resources, mostly time resources, because time is money when you pay people, right? With our stopwatch, how do we structure the production of a car, for example, in such a way that every step of the process is simple, can be done by someone with no training, and therefore inexpensive because we're just pulling them off the street, and in that sense, produce many cars at a low price, okay? So the idea behind Taylor's approach is that people should be thought of as doing and as acting and not as thinkers, right? And that efficiency comes to the extent that we can enhance the predictability of their actions, that we can structure their actions so that they do the same thing all the time, that there's no variability. Where there's variability in action, we need someone to control that variability, and those people are expensive. They're managers. So let's get rid of the variability, right? Let's get rid of the need for buffers. Everything is organized in advance and works according to the set process. And that process, if there's any change, is changed by a very small number of people that we call managers. But labor activity is entirely predictable. People come to the factory door at 9 o'clock. They work till 5 o'clock. They get an hour off for lunch. There's specific times that we shut down the line for them to use the facilities. They have break times, perhaps. Other than that, they're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. Okay? And they're all doing these tasks that we've broken down to the most minute elements. Go ahead.
Would you say, for an example, for like Taylor's method, you could also say that like basic training in the Army is like related to it because it's so managed. Like every hour, they like have, I don't know, never mind. Like, well, I'm trying to say.
There's an element to it, but a better example than basic training is take McDonald's. Okay, right? When you want to produce a hamburger, there are a couple of ways you could do that, right? You can make the hamburger to order like you would in a nice restaurant, a fancy restaurant, okay? Or you can do it in McDonald's where everything is predetermined, taken into account so that we can turn out the hamburgers super efficiently. That's scientific management in food production.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
So we segment this process of taking an order and turning it into a meal into a series of very, very minute steps that require zero training, okay? I can literally take someone off the street and within about a minute show them what they have to do in their job 8 hours a day. And when I put a whole bunch of people into these different positions, I can create a production process at relatively low cost. In other words, high efficiency. With complete predictability. The McDonald's hamburger that you eat today will taste exactly like the McDonald's hamburger. It'll be just as delicious, if that's what you want to call it, as the McDonald's hamburger that you eat tomorrow. Okay? They've mastered that process. Can the person working at McDonald's use their imagination, be autonomous and say, hey, I'm going to try to make this a little bit more tasty by adding a little bit more salt or flipping it slower or whatever they do? Absolutely not. Their function is to work like a robot, right? And everybody does an individual activity. There's really very little interaction. You're doing your own personal, you're working like a robot. The efficiency comes again because human beings are commodities. Human beings have no agency. They do what they're told, right? And there's no variability in what they do. They do it constantly, which makes it very predictable. Everything is planned out in advance. And if there's a change, it's a handful of people that plan out that change, and they do that change with efficiency in mind. They test everything. No change is made unless they can demonstrate using scientific methods that whatever change they make only increases efficiency. Okay? So again, I can't show you, well, I can show you the clip. There's not a lot of sound to see here. This is from the movie Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. There's Charlie Chaplin. No agency. He's not allowed to do that, right? That's not part of the plan. There's no scratching the armpit, right? You got to stay where you are in your position and just keep on doing the same thing 8 hours a day. Got the idea? So here's an element of uncertainty, but that wasn't taken into account, and there's no agency. You can't deal with a fly or a bee or whatever gets in the way there. And Charlie Chaplin takes this to an extreme, right? Here the manager decides to increase the speed. So now Charlie Chaplin in this scene has to use the facilities. And he's showing what happens when you do the same thing 8 hours a day. Charlie Chaplin, by the way, had to leave the United States in the 50s because he was presumed to be by McCarthy a communist, which he probably was. He's on a break. But here's another element. There's no such thing as a break. Watch what happens. This is kind of like 1984. Hey, get back to work. Okay, you got the idea. So Charlie Chaplin is showing that there's a real problem here with scientific management. Where's the humanity, right? What does this do to people? So there's no reflection, there's no agency, there's no thought. People can't be people. And the idea that Taylor was promoting, that it's all fine because everyone's going to make more money, doesn't necessarily help when you're forced to work in this type of a situation. And people become psychologically alienated from their work. So what we see happening with scientific management, anybody know an industrialist that really applied this approach, hook, line, and sinker? I gave you a couple of hints. Go ahead, Elijah.
Ford.
Yeah, Henry Ford was, aware of what Frederick Taylor was doing. Frederick Taylor died before Henry Ford actually took these methods, but some of his disciples, like some of you might have heard of a Gantt chart. Any of you ever heard of a Gantt chart? It's a popular approach to planning out work. You use a Gantt chart. Gantt was one of Frederick Taylor's disciples, and Gantt was one of the people brought in by Henry Ford to transform the auto industry. So kind of like what Tesla is doing now to the auto industry, and Elon Musk, Henry Ford was a similar transformative entrepreneur who used this approach selectively. So you can, when you look at Frederick Taylor, you've got to remember he was saying, let's take the fruits of all this enhanced productivity and distribute it in an equitable way. Like, let's give us a large portion of it back to the workforce. They're earning it. He was aware that this was not necessarily a fun way to work, but the ends justify the means. And Henry Ford didn't exactly operate that way. He did pay a $5 a day wage, which was a huge amount of money back in the 1920s when he took this approach. But still, his profits from applying this approach and building assembly line production in auto manufacturing, profits were immense, were huge, right? And what happens with alienation, psychological alienation, anybody know what happened in the 1930s as Taylorism was adopted more and more in the United States? Well, there was a depression, but the 1930s was the period of massive trade union organization. This is when unions really burst onto the scene in the US and in Europe. And this is even more frightening for the industrialists, for the capitalists, because now we're looking at after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and workers are organizing unions everywhere.
In progress.
There's sit-down strikes. So terrifying for capitalists. Was there a comment? Someone say something? No? Okay. And into the scene in the 1930s emerge some people saying, wait a second, Taylorism may be great, but we're forgetting something. We're forgetting the humanity of work. And this emerges slowly. It emerges first with these industrial engineers, these Taylorist researchers that are setting up the Harvard Business School. And two of them, Mayo and Rothelberger, just get hired as consultants by AT&T, the American phone company, right? American Telephone Telegraph. And they're brought in to a facility in Hawthorne, New Jersey, where they're making multiplexers, these old systems. You've probably seen them in old movies where they're switchboard operators, right? That have to connect one person to another manually. And that's where they're making these switchboards in the Hawthorne facility. And they're industrial engineers, and they decide they want to see how they can boost efficiency. And the argument is, let's play with the context a little bit, lighting in particular, a little bit with temperature, but mostly with lighting, and see how that affects efficiency and productivity. So they start putting in more powerful light bulbs. What do you think happens to productivity as the light is improved in the workplace?
Increases.
And they do this 2 or 3 times, and every time they put in stronger light bulbs, productivity increases. I mean, there are people that were in the factory that talked about the experiment afterwards that said it was so bright in the factory, they started coming to work wearing sunglasses. Okay? And people were starting to complain that it was too bright. It was too bright. So they lowered the lighting a little bit. They took it back one step. What do you think happened? Productivity went up or down?
Still increased, huh?
It increased. So they said, okay, we're doing good. Let's lower it a little bit more and see what happens. So they lower it, and every time they lower it, and now they're back to where they were, but the productivity is at the highest levels ever. What does that tell you? How does light affect productivity?
Changes affect productivity.
What is?
Change maybe affects.
Change. Yeah, one thing we know is that these changes are affecting it. But what is going on with the change? You're right on track. What is it about the change that's affecting the productivity?
Is it the constant change? Like it's not, they're constantly changing the environment. So people are.
Go ahead. You're right on track. Keep on going. People are what?
Because it's inconsistent, people aren't getting used to their environment. So because there's things are constantly changing, they don't have they're not reaching this sort of plateau in their.
It could be that. It could be that people like the change. There's something different going on rather than working like Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line all the time. But what else?
People feel like they are valued.
Yeah. Finally, someone's coming in and talking to them, watching what's going on. There's a little something else going on in the workplace with them, right? They're being treated like human beings. And this was an incredible discovery on the part of these two researchers. And the theory that emerged out of it is that there's a real problem with Taylorism. And the problem with Taylorism is what you saw. That's what Charlie Chaplin was saying. I really encourage you at some point to download that movie, Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. It's a very funny movie, first of all, because it's Charlie Chaplin, but it has an incredibly strong social message that we can no longer put people into this kind of a work environment. And this is what these folks from Harvard were recognizing, that on the one hand, the systems that Frederick Taylor was putting in place were good because it gave people a sense of stability. They had constant work. They had jobs. They felt these organizations got rid of uncertainty. People knew what they were going to do all day, and that eliminated a problem that French sociologists were talking about with the Industrial Revolution, that you take these people coming from small farm communities and you put them in the big city in these factories, and they're lost. And Taylorism gives them structure, so they're no longer lost. That was the argument. Taylorism, and you can see this is all going with Theory X, which is the sort of Tayloristic approach. Taylorism is great because people don't really want to work, and here we're giving them, yes, work, and it's intense, but it's only 8 hours, and they make a lot of money, and then they got 16 hours a day to spend that money and have fun, right? And finally, people are lazy and they need the direction, and you don't want them to run wild because that's not efficient. And this is a system that puts them into a framework that maximizes the benefits for everybody. The human relations people, now we're moving into theory Y, is no, that kind of approach may be efficient, but it has real dysfunctions, that people are thinkers. They like agency. Human beings seek out responsibility. They seek out challenges. And challenge and thought this is part of what we do as human beings. This is why we enjoy play, and work should be like play. And we shouldn't be psychologically distanced from what we do. We shouldn't be alienated. We need to be empowered. So you've heard about empowering workers, right? And this is the first major approach in the 1930s that says, pay attention to the employee and their psychological needs for being connected to others and having a challenge. Have any of you ever worked in a factory, in an assembly line? It's not doesn't happen much anymore. But when I first came to Israel, I was living on a kibbutz, And my first employment experience on kibbutz was working in a fan factory. And it was very similar to what you just saw with Charlie Chaplin. And it was horrible, right? The conditions weren't bad. It was air conditioned already. But basically, I spent the day, every minute or two, I would look at the clock to see how much more time I had, right? And what other people say that work in factories, this wasn't the case in kibbutz because I wasn't getting paid, but what other people say is they calculate in their heads how much money they're making every minute. And that's how they make it through the day. It's a horrible way of actually working. And this is what the human relations people were talking about. So they had a different approach that how can we restructure work and organizations so that people can take on more responsibility and have more challenges and have a little bit more autonomy and feel better about what they're doing. And one of the leaders that emerged as this literally management movement developed was this guy named Chester Barnard, who was not a researcher, had no connection to a university. He was the president of the same company that owned the Hawthorne facility where these multiplexers were being produced. And he understood what these scholars from Harvard were talking about. He was also terrified because of what was happening in Russia and with unions around the world. And he believed that he could transform his organization so that there would be no employee insurrection, no need for unionization. He developed a philosophy which was that leadership is all about getting followers. No one can be a leader without cooperation from below. So you're a terrible leader unless those that you lead are willing to put their faith in you. And you need to earn that faith, right? Leadership is all about achieving the followership and getting the cooperation. In other words, authority, unlike Weber that says authority is given to you when you earn it because of your functional specialization, and we simply endow you with it, we appoint you to a position. Barnett says, no. Maybe that's the formal way it works, but in fact, leaders get the authority because those that they lead are willing to follow them. That's their authority, okay? And that they're leaders and that they're followers, yes, and that the followers have to do things that they may not necessarily like. But in the end, and here he agrees with Taylor, it's all for the good. It creates positive outcomes, better products, services, an economy that's better for everybody. But what we can do is have that same efficiency without all the conflicts that it generates with Taylorism. Let's tone it down. Let's fix things so that people will still work as efficiently, but without all these conflicts. And you can do that by letting people better understand why they're doing what they're doing and making employees feel more engaged and attached. Now, the approach that he takes is the approach of Hitler and Stalin, which is indoctrination, right? You need to indoctrinate your workers so that they feel part of something big. They don't feel like they're coming to work just to make money. They feel like they're doing something that's going to save the world or help the world in some way. You need to make the organization moral. So let's say you're producing refrigerators, okay? As a leader, you're going to constantly be talking to the employees still working on the assembly line like Charlie Chaplin, but make them understand that when they're going like this all day long, what they're doing is making sure that more and more people can eat. They're preventing starvation. They're preventing famine. They're serving a moral purpose in the world. They're not just making, $5 a day. They are the difference between famine and economic development. Wow. Right? Now I can really believe in what I'm doing. I'm not psychologically alienated from it, right? I'm serving a greater purpose. So give people in their heads this notion that they're part of something bigger. Got the idea? It really is indoctrination. To the point that you want them to put the company, the organization, to some degree even before themselves. And Barnard even talks about a story of so he's doing this, right? And he talks about how the day in which he saw he was successful. On that day, he goes out to somewhere in New Jersey, a rural town, where there's an operator sitting in a booth. This is the way the phone systems used to work. There was a little booth in the middle of nowhere where there was a multiplexer, and this operator would be there to connect the phone calls. Someone would say, I want to call Jack on the other side of town. They dial their phone, they'd get the operator, connect me to Jack. The operator would take a wire and connect their phone to Jack's phone. Got the idea? So Barnard walks into this little shack. The operator is sitting there. There's a window behind the operator. And he sees out the window across a field, there's a house on fire, right? And he says to the operator, oh, wow, look, there's a fire going on back there. Look behind you, there's a fire. And the operator says, oh my God, that's my house. My mother, my daughter are in there. And he writes in his book, The Functions of the Executive, that's the name of the book. He writes in his book, this operator was so dedicated to her work, even though she saw her house burning down with her mother and daughter, she did not get up from her job. She stayed on the job. And he said, this was a sign that my indoctrination worked, that the organizational personality was stronger than the individual, that people align themselves with the interests of the firm more than their self-interest, and that I had mastered organization. Now, that sounds a little bit evil, but to a certain extent, it really gives you an idea of the emotional manipulation that leaders engage in, and that Barnard in the Human Relations School argues they need to engage in. That's a rather extreme example, granted, right? But to the extent that as a leader, you can give people a sense that they're part of something much bigger, they're willing to push themselves. Can any of you think about a contemporary leader that did that was really a master at that would dress up and maybe come on stage every once in a while and give a presentation where everybody would just go, yeah. Say again?
Steve Jobs. Oh.
One at a time.
I said Steve Jobs, but
Steve Jobs. Yeah, great example. Great example. This is exactly what he was doing. And it was all emotional manipulation. If you read his biography, people will say that Steve Jobs would ask them to do the impossible. They knew it was impossible, but after speaking with Steve Jobs, they just felt like they had to do it, and somehow they were able to pull it off. They were able to pull off the impossible. All right, let's do the last one. We've got 3 minutes. Very quickly, this last one, I kind of gave you the example, right, from basic training in the Army about how we use this informal, how we use culture and cultural tools to kind of shape the way people interact with each other. And the focus here is on predetermining. I talked about theory X, theory Y, right? X, which is scientific management, theory Y, which is human relations. Here we're talking about theory Z, which is how do we get control without having to stand in front of people and indoctrinate them, propagandize, right? And we can do the same thing using much more subtle techniques. And the subtle techniques that we use, they're a little bit insidious, right? What we do is we build mechanisms that predetermine the way that people make decisions. So think about it. When you make decisions, you base your decisions on certain premises, right? You have two options, and you look at the costs and the benefits of the different options, but there are a whole lot of assumptions you're making that underlie each of those sets of costs and benefits, correct? Everybody with me? So if I can affect those assumptions, I can affect your decisions. Will you feel that I'm making the decision for you, or will you feel that you're still making the decision? If you don't know that I'm shaping, that I'm brainwashing you, right, subtly, and predetermining the assumptions on which you base your decisions, you're going to feel complete autonomy and agency in your decision making. But I, as your manager, am still able to control that decision making. Not to the most final point, but I constrain the decision making so I can say, okay, Yitzchak, you can make the decision. You decide how to do this. But I know that your decision is going to fall between here and here. Okay? It's not going to fall outside of that where it's risky for me. I can let you make the decision, but it's constrained because I brainwashed you that when you make the decision, you think in such a way that no way that your decision will go outside of this range. Got the idea?
Yes.
And we do this.
Like the 3 course with popcorns, like you have the $2, then you have medium, large, and people tend to take the large because it costs just a bit more.
Yeah, I can play games like that. I can use all sorts of mechanisms to do that. But what I do more, let's go back to the basic training in the Army. I put you through basic training and I socialize you through a process, right? And then I put you in the military, I put you in the field of combat, and I say, look, I can't control what you do. You got to make the decisions in the field. And I give you the autonomy because this is something, warfare is not something that's predictable. But by socializing you, I give you a set of premises. I know how more or less you're going to base those decisions. I can take the risk of letting you make decisions. That's what we do in the IDF. That's what's done in the American Army. The Russian Army doesn't operate on those principles. The Russian Army, no one makes their own decisions. Everything has to be checked by superiors, which is an inefficient way of making decisions. It's also alienating.
Can I say something on that as well?
Sure.
Because I'm originally Russian. So in Russia, in schools, one of the topics is how to solve some equations where, X is in like, well, basically I've talked with one of the main guys who make like school programs in mathematics in Russia, and he said that people from army told him specifically that you need to put some examples so that people in army would know how to just go how you're supposed to, what you're supposed to do, sort of. I hope I didn't butcher.
I'm not sure. So what are you saying? That they're trying to make people think more autonomously?
No,
with
less
greater agency, or the
autonomously. Less autonomously,
Okay.
yes.
So consistent with what I was...
Yeah, that school tries to teach you to do things exactly how you're supposed to do it, so that then people in army won't need to think for themselves. They just been told something and they do it. Yeah.
Right. So that's the example, but basically what's going on in tech organizations is this approach where we socialize people quite a bit already in their engineering training. And then when we put them on a job in a tech company, we say, look, you've got to make decisions. You decide when you want to take your vacations, right? You decide how many hours a day you want to work. And when we give them that autonomy, in companies where they say, take as many days of vacation as you want, what happens? Anybody know? No one takes vacations, right? A norm gets built up that only the weak ones take vacations, right? And when we say, work as many hours as you want, just get the job done, what happens? Yeah, people work a little bit from home, but they work 24/7. And it has the opposite effects, right? We so brainwash them in terms of the socialization processes, and there's peer pressure to always do more, to the point that everybody is doing more and no one's telling them to do more. They do it themselves. This is what life in a high-tech company is like. For those of you that have been there, you probably have experienced it, right? No, your boss is not telling you to work more. It's just what you want to do. And this is where it gets a little bit insidious, but there's high empowerment, there's high autonomy, there's a high degree of democracy. On the one hand, on the other hand, much of this is, again, predetermined, and it's a much more hidden form of control. But this is the dominant mode of control that we see in organizations in contemporary society, right? And that control is enforced. You can see it most clearly in something what we call total institutions like mental hospitals or prisons, we use all sorts of symbols, and here's where the term symbolic interaction comes in. Symbols to constantly remind people of what those underlying premises are that they should be using to base their decisions, of what the limits are, right? And what the organization is about. An example of that, for example, if you had come to Israel 20 years ago and gotten on an Egged bus, what color would that bus have been? Anybody know? Egged buses were all red. Why were they red? Egged is a cooperative built through the trade union movement. Red is the color of, Dennis?
Well, blood?
Well, no, socialism.
Oh, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough.
Think of the Russian flag, right? The Soviet flag. What color was it? Red.
Yeah, red, yeah.
Okay? Not by chance. 20 years ago, the union kind of breaks apart. I think people are much more concerned with sustainability and the environment. What color are Egged buses?
Green.
Green, which is a symbol of?
Of ecology.
Ecology, sustainability, not by chance. Not by chance, okay? So these are subtle ways of affecting the way we make decisions, okay? Everything in the organization is structured so that we think in a certain way and make decisions with a certain type of mindset. Got the idea? And you can think of lots and lots of examples in organizations from the way the organization is physically built to what's on the walls of the organization, what color paint is in the organization, right? Are there plants? Like, what does the organization physically look like? So what we've done today, just to wrap up, because I'm over by a lot and I apologize, we talked about these four different perspectives on management, each of them taking a different level of analysis. Some, like Weber, focusing on the organization, some like Taylor focusing on individuals, some that are more rational, some that are more focused on emotional components, some that assume that that try to eliminate conflict, like the human relations school. And some, like Weber, which says there's always going to be conflict, but let's try to constrain it and limit its negative effects by creating systems. Some that focus more on the formal, like Taylor and Weber, and some that focus much more on the informal processes to control uncertainty in organization, or to control uncertainty generally, like the cultural symbolic interaction approach. So that's just to give you an idea of where we're coming from historically when we look at all these issues that we're going to be looking at in the course. None of this stuff is new. It's all been dealt with over the past 150 years. But there's still innovations. We're going to talk a lot about those innovations. Okay, but just to give you sort of a historical perspective where these issues that we're going to be discussing are coming from, they've been discussed for a long time. Questions? Yeah, Elijah.
I'm just not understanding the practical difference between human relations and symbolic interaction. Like, what would be the main thing that separates?
They're both informal. They're both organized around getting into people's heads. But in human relations, it's in your face getting in your head. It's indoctrination. Think of Stalin. Think of Hitler, right? Hitler and his massive speeches. This is what leaders do. They propagandize in your face. They're charismatic leaders that can get you through their rhetoric to do whatever they want you to do. Okay? Do you think that they're God? That's really what it comes down to. And the clip that I wanted to show you that unfortunately I can't show on Zoom is from a movie called Network, where the employee looks up to his boss after he's just gotten lectured to by his boss, and he says, "I've just seen the face of God." Okay? From the movie Network. That's human relations. The symbolic interaction is much more subtle. It's colors. It's photos in different places. It's how you talk to your boss. Do you call your boss, Mrs. So-and-so? Or is your boss chill? Okay, it tells you a lot about the organization and how we interact with each other. If you think about it, in Israeli schools, we're already indoctrinating the kids. In Russia, Dennis, how did you refer to your teacher? By their last name or by their first name?
Last name.
Last name. Israel, how do you refer to your teacher? You guys don't know. First name.
First name.
Absolutely first name. My kids never knew the last name of their teachers. Now, that's already a very, very different way of socializing people. Okay? Reducing power distances. And that has a huge effect later on in life as well. Okay, but we see these same types of things very subtle in organizations. It's not rational. It's focusing on the more cognitive, emotional sides of how we can control behavior in organizations. And this is what we see in tech organizations. The focus is absolutely on these cultural, symbolic interactions approaches. Was that clear, Elijah? Okay. Other questions? Again, I apologize. There are going to be days that we end early as well, so I'll make up for it, I promise. Questions about the course? Anything else? All right, I'll see you guys next week. Fingers crossed that we can meet in person, but I think the chances are pretty small. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.